Welcome to PWS United, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to share education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of PWS United. We have a treat for you all today with Dr. Destiny Pacha. So Destiny Pacha is the president of Empowered Solutions, an organization dedicated to providing educational consulting, IEP advocacy, and support for families and professionals navigating the complex needs of children with PWS and other genetic disorders in school settings. Through Empowered Solutions, Dr. Pacha works closely with families to ensure children receive appropriate educational, behavioral, and health services, while also collaborating with professionals to improve awareness and best practices for supporting students with rare disorders. So Dr. Pacha was a recent speaker at our United in Hope conference, and many of you have heard of her, have spoken with her, worked with her. She's been on the podcast before. And she graciously offered to extend her conference discussion time with caregivers. She created a form for people to submit questions and then came onto the podcast to share those responses with our community. Topics included why or why not to disclose a PWS diagnosis, service requirements in relation to public school versus private schools, the differences between modifications and accommodations in an IEP, special diplomas, how to know if an IEP is being implemented in school, the differences between language therapy and speech therapy, and a lot more. This discussion is a wealth of information for anyone with a child with PWS in school. Along with this episode, we are excited to announce that Dr. Pacha will soon be facilitating a 6-week workshop for caregivers of individuals with PWS called Empowering PWS Families in IEP Meetings. Now, towards the end of this episode, Dr. Pacha talks about what this training will look like, so you'll get more information from her. We now have a date. It will begin Tuesday, October 14th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and all others will be at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you'd like to sign up for this training, and I recommend you do it soon, as it sounds like space will be limited, please fill out the form using the link in our show notes. I also recommend that you sign up for our Pulse newsletter and follow us on Facebook and Instagram so you can stay informed of dates and details of this training and if there are more trainings, along with all the other resources we offer, of course. You will find link to that in the show notes. You will also find links to Dr. Pacha's website and her social media. So don't forget to check out those show notes. While you're there, leave us a rating and review. We would greatly appreciate it. We have a special episode coming up in a few weeks, and we would love to share some new reviews in that episode. But until then, we just want to say thank you to Dr. Pacha for all of the incredible work and time that she puts into our PWS community and for coming on to the PWS United podcast to share her knowledge and experience. This episode is just packed with valuable information. So without further ado, let's get into it. Well, Destiny, thank you so much for being here and for being willing to answer these questions and to help provide even more information for families.
Thank you for having me again. I was super excited when we kind of got together and decided to try to give this little extra opportunity. I really don't like not being able to answer everyone's questions, and you kind of get shooed out sometimes at the conference rooms. And there were so many good questions. So I thought this was a neat little fun way. And if your question is not answered live, like through the podcast, I will reach out because your emails were collected and kind of give you some info because I thought they all were really great questions. So I'm ready to jump in.
All right. So the first question is, why would families choose not to disclose PWS diagnosis?
So the disclosure of PWS kind of came up in one of the presentations. I think it was maybe the first one where it was the early, kids getting their first IEP. And sometimes families do choose not to. Sometimes they're, advised by maybe a medical professional or somebody else in the field. And I think some of it kind of goes back to an older way of thinking that if you disclose, they're going to like automatically kick you into a different school or, they're not going to let you come into their regular school. Really, that's not quite the case these days, but there are, every family has to make that decision on their own. And I support the family's choice. What I will say is that, some of the medical professionals that do, sometimes say that there are specific reasons. So sometimes families aren't looking at a traditional school and maybe disclosing when there really aren't any of the we all get it. Teachers are going to Google, they're going to see some of, all those negatives, and then they might be like, your child's not a good fit and never even meet them. So I do think that there are definitely cases where, depending on the school, the setting, the city, families may choose not to do that. I tend to, if I'm coming in to support a family, usually, there's been some difficulties or struggles already, and it is hard to defend some of the supports and services that a child with PWS would need in the school setting if the school doesn't know. But I have helped families, especially if you've gone for years without telling a school and then you need to tell them, kind of having somebody there to support you is helpful. But I guess that really would be the reason. And it's a personal choice. That, again, is not my decision. I'm here to support the family and what they want. But I think that would be the reason why they may not right away.
Yeah, that was an interesting question. I mean, my approach to it is we've always been very open about it from the start. And so it's always interesting to me to hear families who choose not to disclose it and why. And yeah, I think it makes sense. It's a hard thing to bring up if people are going to do that Googling and you don't have access to giving them, the information right away that you want them to have.
It's like you have to have everything ready right away, and I
Yes,
think that's also stressful too. I mean, trying to figure out what is it that you're going to give, especially depending on where your child is at in the spectrum, because obviously the spectrum keeps changing. They're aging, different areas may become needing more support or less support. So it's like when you decide to do it, it's kind of also making sure that the people in the school or whomever understand that it's not locked in. Things
right.
may change. And so if you don't have that on hand, that can be stressful for a family. So that's definitely when, making sure that you've reached out to PWSA or, your medical providers to have things ready to help maybe alleviate that stress also on the parents. Cause that's a hard discussion to have.
hmm I just had the experience of taking Freya to camp and I gave them like the elevator pitch of PWS. It was literally like 2 minutes. And I was very nervous sending her off, but she did great and she had a great time. So anyway, that's my little side note. All right, next question. What are the benefits and the negatives of private versus public education for kids with disabilities?
That is like a really big question. Obviously, and things are changing. So I'm going to kind of in our politics right now. So I'm just going to kind of go where we are at right now. So children with disabilities are protected under a couple different federal legislations, but the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is for public schools. So for a child that is found eligible under IDEA and services are determined necessary, then that's on the school to provide those services free to cost for the families, right? So public schools are underneath that legislation. Private schools don't have to be. So, there are some private schools that, depending on the state you live in, there are scholarships or there's other opportunities where they might take in federal money, or parents have the choice to take in federal money or the state, the funding of scholarships. So they might use that money then to get services. But if you go to a private school, they're not required to do that on campus at free of cost. Some private schools will allow private therapists to come on campus, but really when it comes to, pros and cons, it depends on where your child is, and what they're needing. But to receive special education services under IDEA, you need to be in a public school or some sort of public charter. Again, that can differ widely across all the states. So I would say that, an advantage of public is having those services. I'm sure there are plenty of advantages of a private school, whether it's smaller settings. But again, you're not guaranteed those services that your child might need, or you're going to have to be highly involved in scheduling, paying for things like that, where again, in the public school, that would be done. So I guess that would kind of be a bit of the pros and cons of each and a very, very high level, like just basic looking down on it.
Freya goes to a public charter school. So you're saying that even though it's a charter school, because it's a public charter school, then she gets.
So it actually depends on how they form their charter and what
Oh,
funding.
okay.
So, like where I'm at, we're like a school choice mecca for families here in Florida. So they can choose to pull their money out of the state and go anywhere. But once you do that, you give up the right of any, services that your child would be provided because you're now given that money. So some charters will pull in state funding, and if they follow and receive the money that would go under the IDEA, then they would be able to provide those services. And there are some charters that are just for students with disabilities and just for students with IEPs. Again, you have to ask and check on that. Sometimes it gets a little muddy too because there are private schools that will contract with school districts. So if a child's least restrictive environment is determined to not be a public school, then the district will fund the private school. And at that point, the IEP is still in place because the district is then going to provide the services that were on that IEP, whether it's through funding the private school or funding in contract workers. So that just, again, it gets a little bit difficult, but it's getting some support in that area within your district or state would be helpful. But there are lots of different options. But in general, if you want to have special ed services, you need to be in a public school, just on a basic general.
Okay. I have a lot more questions there, but I will I will leave it. But that has just been something through Freya's the course of her schooling and trying to get services. And one of the things that we come up against is we just don't have certain therapists. We are not a highly populated area, and so yeah, that's a rabbit hole I want to go down another time of just like
I feel
what
like
happens
we
at.
could do, yeah, we can do a whole podcast on that one because it is, well, and it's becoming more and more common. When they came out with some of the recent statistics on, the students that are served under IDEA, one of the biggest issues is actually filling those positions. So a lot of districts are contracting out or having to do virtual. So I have some families who receive speech therapy virtually from a therapist in another state. And, obviously some therapies that would be very, very difficult for. Others might not be as difficult. I mean, with telehealth, sometimes doing a counseling session or, talking with someone can be done that way, but not everything wouldn't be possible to really do PT when the person's on a computer in another state. So, but that, they are having to get creative just because the positions are really, districts are really struggling to fill those positions in special ed and with the itinerant service providers like the therapist.
So if anybody's out there wanting to go back to school and you're not sure what to study, become a therapist. Okay, number three, and next one. Do homeschooled kids receive any services from district, or do we forfeit any part of services by choosing to homeschool?
Oh, see, that kind of falls under that last question. So it would depend on, so a lot of districts will offer things like a virtual model. And sometimes in virtual models, they are, like we were just saying, able to provide some services. But if you completely pull out and go into, a complete homeschool setting, you need to check with your district's what's called like a non-public office. Because there are some that can have itinerant services, meaning if you need speech, the parent typically would be, responsible for transporting the child to school to get that therapy, but some districts do allow for that. But it would be that you need to contact your non-public office and find out what services or how that's able to be done for your child if they are at home and being educated at home. Again, depending if you're in a state where you receive the money, then you do forfeit it because then you're given the money to then use. However, again, if you just kind of go and contact your district's non-public office, then they can usually guide you into, what's available and what's allowed based on the official, title that you've enrolled your child under.
All right, so this person said, I think my son's IEP is well written, but how do you know if it is being implemented at school? I think that's a great question.
That's a great question. You're right. So, really, without being there, we all kind of entrust our children's education and health and safety to the staff that's there. And, I believe in your gut feeling. But if you're sitting there and you're really like, is this really happening? You have the right to ask for service logs. You have the right to ask for accommodation logs. I'm not going to say that they're going to be, something the school's going to be like, oh, yeah, we keep it right here. Sadly, that's not typically the case. But, if you're kind of already knowing or you have a, feeling, Some service providers are covered, sometimes by Medicaid. So they have a different way of having to monitor their hours. So those are a lot easier. Those are usually your itinerant services. So your speech, your language, your PT, and your OT usually have to keep their own, and it's in like a different system. What gets difficult is like teachers. So, they usually just say, well, if the child's here, we did it. But, that can be difficult to prove. So that's when lesson plans could be, asked for, or, I mean, every teacher has those. So sometimes principals oversee those. Sometimes teachers just maintain them. They're getting, let's say, social skills. You have the right to, say, hey, what was the lesson for this week? Or, what's being covered so we can cover it at home. And that can also be built into the IEP of just giving a heads up or giving you afterwards of what we discussed. So then you can continue that at home. One session a week isn't going to, help a child necessarily be able to generalize that. And if you're at home and you see a situation coming up, you might want to know what was going on. So, whether that's through notes or progress reports, but at minimum, your IEP progress report, when you build that IEP, every goal has to have how they're monitoring it, how frequently you're going to be told about it, and when that's going to happen. So some districts might say quarterly with report cards, but not every district in the country does quarterly report cards. So it just depends, but that is built into every goal. And I know we talked about that during the conference. That was part of one of my presentations, was understanding what should be part of a goal. So asking questions, asking for, the follow-up, and asking for the data. That's a big one. They kind of say, if you don't have the data, it didn't happen. So what that looks like is going to depend on every goal. But I would just say, making sure that you're reviewing those progress reports. And if it doesn't give you anything but like making progress, I would be asking. That's a making progress and they don't give a note, or they don't give,
Mhm.
any of the data. I would just say, hey, can I see where, where we're at, how close we are? Because obviously those benchmarks, if they're built in, they need to be meeting them every so often and kind of making sure that the goals are still appropriate. Because that, unfortunately, again, teachers, they, I do believe they go into it for the love of kids, but let's be honest, they keep getting more and more on their plate. So if you get a progress report that only says making progress, there really needs to be more behind that. There should be the data collected.
And I wonder, is it helpful for a parent to keep their own log, kind of like if their kid is coming home with like certain behaviors, and so to kind of start logging that and notice that pattern?
Absolutely. I believe in I mean, that's usually what I'll do is if I'm, meeting with a family, and one of the big ones I get is I'm called all the time to pick them up from school. If you are being called to pick your child up from school, you need to have a separate little calendar, put it in your phone, star that call, because all of that is important, especially if a child is starting to have an increase in behaviors, or you're finding that a school is not responding in a way that's helpful to your child. Every time they get sent home, that is showing that there might be a need of either an FBA or a change in their behavior plan, or honestly, they're limited to the number of times they can do that. But if they call you to pick them up and there's nothing documented, all we have is your log. So yes, if you start, your kids coming home and saying this happened, check in, put it in an email. Hey, just wanted to check in. They said they didn't go to speech today, whatever might have been the case. If a therapist is not there one day, then typically they try to make up a session. But there's usually a built-in of they miss one, and some districts now write their services that way, 1 week out of the month in case the person's out or absent. If the child is absent, though, they aren't required to make that up. So that's also important to know. So if you keep a log of when your kid is absent, or when they ask you to pick up, or when, they might say, oh, we didn't get to go to adaptive PE today, just keep a note of that so that you can kind of follow back up with that later.
All right. Next question. Can you push for service pullouts like OT, PT, speech, adaptive PE to be done outside of the educational instruction times and have them put that in the IEP? For a while, all of my daughter's pullouts were during the times where her teacher was actively teaching. I asked them to make changes. They did a little, but I see room for improvement.
Yes, yes, and yes. So schools, their number one job, right? I mean, besides health and safety, is to educate your child. So if all of their child services are being done when the teacher is teaching, how is the child going to make progress towards the state standards or the general standards? So I typically, if there are questions about how this is going to be done, not only just because we all need to know what's happening every day in their, your child's life, but also for the child. What does their daily schedule look like? Sure that you have that so that you can see when these services are being done. And plus, having a visual schedule for a child with PWS is typically one of, the number one accommodations and supports. So trying to identify when that is, but a lot of districts will have kind of within their own mandates. So some districts and states will say, a child is supposed to be instructed for 60 minutes in ELA every day. And then they have maybe an additional 30 minutes for intervention or enrichment. And they really shouldn't be pulling during those core instructional times, because otherwise the child's never going to be instructed on what they need to be
Right.
learning. Now, what it gets difficult is when kids are receiving a lot of services, but again, they still have to be receiving that basic instruction. So I would be, if this was, my child, or if I was supporting this family, I would just be asking for that schedule and trying to figure out, because I get it. OTs and PTs may have a ton of kids on their roster, and they're one person, maybe in a large school. But that is why schedules need to be looked at and changed. I mean, it really needs to be for the child, and, not working around when a therapist might want to have lunch. And I'm not saying that's the case all the time. Definitely not. I have great friends. I'm probably going to end up getting phone calls after this. But, making schedules is hard. I get it. So, but we do need to make sure that a child is receiving all of their instruction as well during the day.
Yeah, I like that clarification. Okay. This person would like to know if you could email your slideshow or if it was taped to view later.
So I have started to turn my slides into handouts. I do a lot of what I've kind of coined, although I've seen this term used, one-pagers in different ways. I think sometimes it's good to get all that research, make it in something with a visual, easy to read, whether it's for an aunt, a cousin, a teacher, a speech therapist. And as families, reach out to me with different, areas of concern, I've created a bunch of them. So I started making them based on the presentations I did, because I was receiving so much request for that. So I was going to post today that will be coming out, and I will have those available on my website. So I've kind of taken some of the big parts and condensed them, just kind of to give a snapshot of what to be looking for when you're in your child's IEP meeting. And then as far as I know, it was not recorded. I've seen a few clips where people have put stuff on like social media of me talking, but not like an extensive amount. So I will, as soon as I can, or maybe we'll just turn them into a webinar. Maybe that would be easier to kind of do it again. But we can talk about that later. But I do not keep any of my information under lock and key. It is for all to use. I just also want to make sure that when things go out, that it's not then, how do I say it? I don't want someone who doesn't have knowledge about Prader-Willi to then maybe take it and try to present it, because then I also worry that if they don't understand the nuances, then we might be getting misinformation out there.
Right.
So maybe we can look at some webinars or something where I can be available, and then we'll obviously talk about the training series in a little bit.
Yeah, I love that idea. All right. This person says that we feel that our school has the mentality of this is just how it's done. How do you recommend we handle that?
That's a tough one. And it does. I mean, it happens even in meetings where I sit in on. And I think sometimes the IEP team and the members of that team forget how important their role is in the IEP development and in deciding what that child actually needs and what is appropriate for that child. Because they do kind of get stuck in, well, this is just, we offer this class at this time and this is what we're doing. And for example, I was in a meeting the other day where they're like, well, our special ed teacher pulls during this time for reading, but they're working on phonics and he doesn't need that. So he's just not going to go to that class. Well, I mean, that's true. I don't want him in a pull-out special ed class that he doesn't need, but what is it that he needs? Then we need to figure out how to create and develop that, because the whole idea is that every IEP should be individualized. So if the child doesn't need phonics but needs something else, then we need to be looking at how can that be provided? Who can provide that and when? But a lot of times the members of a team forget, if they say that's what the child needs, then that's what needs to be done. So reminding them that they have that, it's like a superpower. The IEP team makes those decisions. So if the team decides something, then we afterwards go back and figure out how is that going to work. And that might be when administration has to come in, because obviously if they're going to have to hire a teacher or build in something different, we need to have some bigger stakeholders involved, or maybe the meeting just gets tabled for a little bit and they come back when they can have everyone there that needs to be talking about it. But the whole idea of an IEP is not to fit every child in a box. And I don't care if you put special ed tape on it and say this is the special ed box, it's still a box. And we know none of our kids are going to fit in the same box, nor every other kid going to fit into the same box.
I love that. Do you have tips for what to add to our 5-year-old son's IEP for writing and vision supports that help children with hypotonia and related vision challenges?
Yes, and I do want to say if the family's listening, I did already email them a whole bunch, but just kind of as an overview, I think that idea of the visual perception when it comes to those early years of the handwriting and, we have already the hypotonia, we already have the fine motor difficulties. And then if a child is struggling to see where they're trying to put their hand, then yes, that's going to be a lot of difficult, as they start aging and trying to write into smaller boxes. So that's definitely the first thing would be to make sure that your school team and your, the occupational therapist or whomever is in the school or at the district knows of your concerns because maybe an evaluation needs to be done. But there are tons of accommodations that can be done for that. Even as simple as maybe making, some of the lines bolder so that they can see for sure where those lines are. Because you copy something a few times and the lines are gone, right? And so not only are you giving a kid a space that's very tiny, but there's no lines. So sometimes it's just as easy as just making really dark lines so that they can write within that. Making sure that, the child, again, seated, close if there is vision concerns. I do work with some families where a child is considered legally blind. So, making sure that they're ordering the large print text and the large print workbooks. We had a hiccup with that this year with the family where the school didn't do it early enough and really were struggling and kind of scrambling at the last minute to get those. Sometimes having different adapted tools, whether it's, a pencil grip to help with that or a slant board is often, put on, especially early on to help with that for the fine motor or the pressure, that they can have their hand in a different position to be able to write. There are even things that have either a raised area or a recessed area, right, to like help them be able to navigate. But also another one is where it can be a lot more fun of just making sure it's like, doing practice, not just with a pencil. Things like in sand with your finger or pinching pom pom balls, all of that's going to help with that. It may not, if your number one focus right now is handwriting, you have to have the strength to do that anyways. So I know for my son, when he was younger, we were focusing on like pressure and too much, too little. And so, I was recommended when it's safe enough, let me just put that out there, getting like little like push pins and cardboard and making sure that, they know how far and what pressure can do what to kind of practice
Oh,
not
yeah.
like tearing paper, but also not like not putting a hole in it. I think I found some that, had little balls on them. So they were a little bit easier for him to grip and try to practice with that. But there's so many different techniques. And I'm actually, with that question and the amount of stuff I did send for that family, maybe that's my next one pager. And we'll get it out there then, because there are a lot of fun things. And, I think the biggest thing is also not making it an activity that is just despised by the child. It already is hard. And I think that's what I think parents understand, obviously, way more than sometimes the school staff, but it is just so hard, that fine motor and then the strength. And then talk about second half of the day. They've already been going all day. And that sometimes is what I ask schools. Like, if you're telling me that things get really bad, what time of day are we talking about? Is there, writing is getting well, yeah, it's the second half of the day. They've been going all day. Maybe they had PE right before. There's so much going on, but making sure that there are some built-in fun with it and not just focusing on that pencil in hand, because then we're just going to end up building more of an issue with the writing that then can become behavioral later on, even beyond when it's maybe not so much of the fine motor. So yeah, just, different ideas and that I will make a note and maybe that'll be the next thing we come out with.
Yeah. What I love how creative you can get with that stuff. And I mean, that was always, I homeschooled my girls when they were younger, and there's so many fun ways to learn all of that. And they go to Waldorf school, so it is very artistic. And so, yeah, the sand, the water and soap in the shower, whatever, just all those different ways of, and then like the letter recognition. There's just a lot of fun ways to practice that. Freya, that was an issue she had of writing too dark, and then also the perseveration of having to
Perfection.
have it perfect, and so all the erasing and, there's been a lot of paper ripping, from the erasing. So it's something that we
Well, and that's where, if you have a different thing than paper, that can help. Even keeping, I know there were some deal days. I don't necessarily want to say what, but I think we all know how much cardboard probably came into that house, using that to write on because a lot harder to tear and rip, but good to practice on. But absolutely. And I want to make sure families know that doesn't have to be expensive. There's a lot of kits out there that I am shocked at the price when, honestly, I think I used for a while like sand that I bought to put in my umbrella stand. And it's just sand, but it's a lot cheaper than if you go on and try to buy some sort of, now I'm not saying it's something that is dangerous for a child, but you can get things
Yeah.
that you can use and it doesn't have to cost a fortune. Or things around your house you already have, throw them in a bin. I see some really cute ideas of, changing it up for different, seasons and just keeping it fun and also keeping that so they don't satiate on it, and changing it up is always a way to kind of make it a little bit more inviting and fun for the kids.
Yeah. Those are great ideas. Okay, so during the presentation at the conference, you talked a little about modification versus accommodations. We live in South Dakota, and I'm not sure if this is specific to our state or if this is everywhere, but if our daughter has any modifications in high school, she will not get a diploma. Did you say modifications are usually only for a small percentage of the population? I thought I saw 1%.
So this is another big question. I do a lot of even training for schools to understand accommodations versus modifications. So for this particular family, if this is you out there, I am going to email you some stuff specific to South Dakota. So when you are looking at accommodations and modifications, I kind of use the idea of an accommodation is like evening the playing field. And this was part of my presentations. A modification changes the rules to the game or the game altogether. Right. So you're kind of changing what the child is learning or is required to do to show learning and mastery. So there's an example that is often I use a lot, like, okay, well, a child with PWS doesn't need to do, let's say, 50 math problems. I mean, sometimes I don't think any kid needs to be doing 50
Right.
math problems for homework, but let's just say that's the assignment. So an accommodation, well, let's first with a modification. A modification would say, do the first 10 problems. But what if every 10 problems, one was addition, one was subtraction, one was multiplication, one was division, and you say, okay, just do the first 10 problems. That's a modification because you've now not asked the child to do all the other skills that were on that, assignment. However, if in shortening an assignment can be an accommodation, if it is, kind of shortening an assignment to show mastery of the skills. So instead of saying do the first 10, maybe do the first two of every section. Then you're accommodating by shortening how many, but you're not changing what the child is expected to learn and show that they know how to do. So that's a big difference. South Dakota is a little different when it comes to, at least from recent research, they do not have what many states use as an alternative assessment. And that's a whole nother ball of wax we could go into and talk for days on. So the Education for Students Act, they allow states to make some decisions in if they want to have that alternative assessment or if they're going to come up with maybe alternative standards. But in South Dakota, if at that time the IEP team does decide that a child requires modifications to the learning standards and the learning objectives, then yes, that is pretty much going down a path of an alternative diploma option. Again, what that looks like for every state and what it's called is different. So some states have gotten rid of that, special diploma is what many, families might remember it being called. And sometimes it's now being called an alternative diploma. Here in Florida, it's called a standard diploma on access points, meaning you are instructed on an alternative standards, but if you can pass those classes, you still get a standard diploma on access points, and it's only for students with an IEP. Every family does need to understand that and truly grasp what that does for your child later on, because when you go down that path, you can decide later on that that's not the path you want your child on. But what I say is, let's say you decided this in third grade and now in eighth grade, you want your child on regular standards again. Now, from third to eighth grade, they might have been on alternative. That's a lot of differences that the child may not have received instruction on everything that then we're expecting them to know. So the idea of having modifications, if truly to change what the child is expected to learn and know, does kind of change what path they might be on. Now, other states will allow you to modify certain subjects and not other subjects. Some you're not allowed to modify at all unless you are completely changing the student's kind of path on what their instructional standards are. So states have that option, like I was saying, to look at their state expectations and then We call them access points. Other places call them different things, different standards that are required to build up to that. And again, only offered to students with what's considered a significant cognitive disability. So yes, it is only meant for a very, very small part of the population. The idea is that every child has the right to attempt and obtain the highest standard of education they can. And the standards are what is set by the state. But I will say that for this family, I am going to reach out because South Dakota does have a little bit different in that they chose not to have that alternative assessment. But if the team has decided that, then it does change the path for later on.
Right. So I'm guessing or assuming maybe that if someone does get the alternative diploma, that affects what jobs they could get or if what college they could get into if they wanted to. But maybe if they are seeking the alternative diploma, they're likely not going to do those things or
So, I mean, now the options available to students that go down an alternative path are greater than ever. Well, they were greater than ever. Obviously, things might be changing, so I don't want to guarantee that for moving forward forever and ever. But a lot of colleges have started a different, whether it's a certificate path or different options for children with developmental delays and cognitive disabilities to still be able to attend college. Sometimes it might be certain courses, it might be towards a certain certificate. There are colleges that offer on campus living for individuals with developmental disabilities. So I don't ever want to say it's going to completely say that a child's, nothing's going to happen anything further than, high school. That is absolutely not the case anymore. But it does have to be looked at for every child individually. It does prevent a child from going into the military. Now, if they go back somehow and decide to take the courses to kind of get the, an alternative diploma for, I shouldn't say alternative there, like a GED or something, but on that alternative path, it does limit going into a university program in a regular 4-year college kind of program that people might think of as a university. But again, it doesn't mean you can't go. It's just not going to be that same diploma track or that same, going for different degrees. They're going to be very specific. And a lot of the universities and colleges are now having those options. So it's important to know what that is when you're making that decision. But yeah, it limits, but it also opens other doors. So being on that track does also typically open doors for having that transition services that might be happening between 18 and 22, qualifying, individuals and at that time young adults for different programs because they're already on that track of, needing that extra support maybe for finding a job or, any sort of the post-secondary transition services. So really, again, it is meant for a very small population, but it is something that can be both. I could not make a decision right now on any child that I don't know, and truly understand. But that is something that is important for parents to know when they're sitting in those meetings like this family to truly understand what are the ramifications, good or bad, that come out of making that decision.
yeah. I had never heard of this, so I'm really grateful to know this. Freya is in 8th grade this next year, but then she'll be moving on to high school, which will look very different than what she's been mainstreamed this whole time because she's at a small school and high school. It's going to look very different. And so I'm grateful to know that that is something that I have to think about, the type of diploma. I didn't even know.
Well, and it's something that sometimes, and I have sat in many meetings where I feel like this is kind of glossed over with families. And if I'm involved in that meeting and I feel like that's happening, I will either ask for a break or ask for us to reconvene because again, whether I believe it's right or wrong for that child or that is parental's choice, my job is to help them understand and make sure they have the knowledge to make that decision in that moment for their child, not for me to persuade them one way or another. I think with every child, again, being individual and things changing over time, we really have to take everything into account. Nothing should be based on one test. Sometimes it'll be, oh, you have the IQ score of whatever, and that's it. Well, we already know that IQ score for, individuals with PWS can vary greatly. There's peaks and valleys, the spiky cognitive profile. So making sure that really understanding what that means is super important.
Okay. So you mentioned something about language therapy versus speech therapy. Can you explain what you mean? Our daughter has speech therapy on her IEP, but I'm not sure I understand the difference.
Sure. So under IDEA, it is clumped together, but they are different areas of language. So speech typically is your articulation. It can also include your tone or Some people, think of like stuttering, that's all under kind of the speech when you're trying to make the sounds and make the words. Language is more of the processing of that. So processing of the information that's coming in and then being able to respond expressively, however that might be, because, using words is not the way that every child can or chooses to communicate, depending on the situation. So speech is really or articulation, and language is really that kind of processing, understanding, and then communicating that, which also can be pragmatic. So your social skills, your social cues, which tend to be areas of difficulty for children with PWS. So a child on the IEP can be eligible for speech language, and usually it just has kind of the slash mark or a hyphen. But really, the way to know what your child is needing is to look at the evaluation. Was it a speech or was it a language? And then look at the goals. Are the goals for making specific sounds or different, phonemes, or is it for understanding or being able to retell a story? Those are kind of, and if you're not sure, ask the speech language pathologist, the SLP that, is working with your child, because sometimes the speech is what I think a lot of parents think of as speech and language. It's just that speech of producing. Can you make the S, the SH, the R sound? But really, for children with PWS, I mean, that language component is huge. They can be very social. We know that. Very caring, outgoing, charismatic. But then really the information that they're understanding and truly able to process can be vastly different. So individuals, I should say, but since we're talking IEPs, children with PWS, they can have a very high verbal IQ score, just saying, the cognitive, they're verbal. But then when they have a full language evaluation, really their receptive and expressive language can be vastly different. And I think I even joked about this in one of my presentations at the conference was, I kind of get on soapboxes. And right now that's one of my big ones. It used to be health plans. I'm working really hard on that. Doesn't go away. But now it's that language aspect of it, of how many times I sit in a meeting, they're like, oh, well, they can talk really well. They love to talk to me. They can tell me. And I'm like, but when you get that evaluation and you truly see what they're able to receptively understand can be very different. So I would say if you're unsure, ask your SLP, but also, look at the evaluations and the goals that have been put in the child's IEP.
Hmm. So our daughter still really needs to nap in the afternoon. Is it possible to have a shortened school day?
Possible, of course, if that's, what the IEP team and the parents are searching for. I will caution on that right now. There's some pretty big lawsuits going on right now where districts were doing or proposing a lot of shortened days. The state is required to provide an education to the child. So when they start shortening days, they're shortening that education, right? So if a child is put on a shortened day, it really, really should only be for a short period of time, or the team needs to come back together very frequently to evaluate that need. Now, if a parent says, my child, I'm going to come pick them up at 1:00 every day, the school is typically going to be like, okay, you're going to come pick their child up, but they may not put that on the IEP because they're not recommending that. But the parent says, I know this is what they need. So, you might pick them up. Or, to be honest, how many therapies and stuff, we can't all schedule it after school. So sometimes they do roll over. So schools are typically, I would say, very understanding of that, especially if it's on a schedule that they know. But actually shortening the child's day, splitting their minutes that they are required or they have the right to have that education, having the school decide to shorten that, I would caution any family. I would just make sure that it is understood, is there a length of time? Is there a fade plan? Are we fading back in? And we've definitely had to do that. Don't get me wrong. A child goes and has, surgery for their scoliosis, and then we drop school and we might pick up hospital homebound, but then we got to go back to full day. That just may not be realistic, and it may not be the best for that child or most appropriate. So yes, maybe we fade in, but if a district is asking you to shorten the school day, again, I caution that. Now, it sounds like for this parent, they're worried about their child having a nap. So again, depending on the age, because, naps are early on, but not really later. Sometimes we word it as, having breaks or rest breaks, or maybe we need to look at that schedule, because I do strongly believe in non-contingent breaks. Meaning they don't have to earn breaks throughout the day. We already know how hard the day is for them. So maybe there's a built-in block of, oh, we know that this, is not, as that other family was asking about reading and math. Like we're not going to build that in during the core reading program, but maybe there's a part of the day where the other kids are able to do something and they can take a rest if they choose, or have the option or have an area to go. Obviously schools do start worrying if like they're napping for 2 hours a day at school, because then they do feel like, okay, well, now we're responsible for educating. How are we going to do this? And those are talks that need to be openly had if your child is at that point still, or maybe transitioning out of those nap levels into non-nap areas, and how can we even maybe fade or transition to help them with that. So yeah, I guess we get it. We know, napping and rest are important, but maybe building in smaller ones throughout, and then coming back to trying to get to that full day.
Yeah, that one's a hard one. I know it's a hard one for Freya. I've had to go pick her up before because she just couldn't stay awake.
Absolutely. And
So,
and that's where, it's again, it's whether it's something that you feel or the school feels. If you're doing it and you recognize and you understand the ramifications of that. Is it worth her being there, being pushed, pushed, pushed to keep going? And then, obviously it's likely she's going to be very dysregulated. She's exhausted, and then being pushed to keep going, then that's probably not best for her. And that's a decision you make. But if a school is telling you that, that's when I get cautious, just because, it is their ultimate job to provide that education.
okay. Yeah, that's a good clarification. So, this is probably a bigger question, but how do you balance advocating for your child's needs while maintaining a collaborative relationship with the school team? I am still laughing of you saying sometimes you have to be a wrecking ball.
Yes, I think my daughter had that song in my head, and I was like, yeah, sometimes I have to be a wrecking ball. That is not how I choose. That would not be my number one way of ever dealing with the school. I spent over 20 years in the public school system. So I know deep down that the majority of people that I come in contact with have the kids' best interests at heart. I think over time, you can get worn down, or you are told so many times, we just don't have that. We don't do that. Going back to that other question. So that can be difficult. And, especially if a child's safety, health
Mm.
are being put on the line, or if a child is possibly being expelled and kicked out of school, then yes, I don't typically have enough time to collaborate and start from scratch. So, we do have to come in strong, fix that so the child is safe and in school and receiving their appropriate education. And then we can kind of go back and rebuild. But again, I'm saying that as the not the parent in these situations. As the parent, if you go in too hard, you do sometimes risk, that relationship that you're going to be with this school now for maybe 6 years, maybe less if it's middle school, or maybe longer if it's, a K-8 kind of model. So trying to go in and collaborate first and trying to be understanding and not thinking they're all coming at you or your child. However, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's parents that have tried and tried and tried for years, right? And then they feel like now their child is still not getting it. Yeah, you might need to get a little bit more, as they say, mama, or I should say dad bear, too. You can kind of come in and have that. I mean, you're trying to do what's best for your child. Again, health and safety, obviously, number one. If something like that is coming up, then yeah, you've got to take care of that immediately. But it is a balancing act. And when we get to it, there are strategies I recommend. There are, ways of approaching it and who to go to, and not just jumping from A to Z, in your procedural safeguards and your options for when you're trying to communicate what you're trying to say, because it can be hard in a meeting. I always say you sit down and you might have 20 eyes on you, and you're just one person trying to be your child's advocate, nurse, parent, counselor, and trying to recognize you have all these people that are now coming at you with different ideas. But recognizing where those allies are is a really good one, knowing where and who on that team. Sometimes parents are like, oh, my child's had the same speech person since they were 3 and they're now in 6th grade. Typically that they're like, I know if I ask or if in a meeting, they'll be supportive and help me or make sure that, I'm understanding what's being done. And then sometimes you have new team members who have no idea about your child or about PWS. And sometimes they're coming in from higher up, district staff, and they have no clue. They're trying to make sure that they have that information ahead of time. I don't like being caught off guard. I know school staff doesn't either. So if you have a new team member coming and you see that on your invite, then maybe it's send some information ahead of time so they know what they're walking into. Because it's really hard when all of a sudden you're being told that this child has this condition you've never heard of, and they're asking for what the parent feels is just basic needs. And in your mind, though, in comparison, whether it's a one-on-one or a special lunch place, or they're like, what? I don't even understand why that would be a problem, or, something that you'd be asking for. So kind of making sure to give the education and give the information, but still standing strong. I mean, there are policies and procedures that if this district doesn't follow, you have those procedural safeguards. And, I know by the time you get it for the 18,000th time, a copy of that, but making sure that you do understand it and you have read it. And there's typically a phone number or an email address if you have questions on that, but kind of what are your processes if you don't agree with the team? and where do you go from there? And there are different ways to even have like a facilitated meeting where somebody comes in that has nothing to do with either side, and maybe it's just that you're not understanding or they're not understanding what you're trying to say because you're not using that terminology that educators are used to hearing. So, yeah, I always say start collaboratively. That's the best way to go. But there are times that you may have to come in like a wrecking ball.
Yeah, and then that's when also I have found because I'm very much like in the collaborative diplomatic, I wanted to be kind to everybody, make sure that they had no ill feelings towards me so that it didn't, affect their care of Freya, really. And hopefully they're professional enough that that wouldn't happen, but we're all human. But then, there have been a few times when it's been a matter of, safety. And so that's when I reach out to like PWSA, or I live in California. So PWCF, that's when you can get help from outside resources, whether that's a letter or having somebody also attend the meeting. So that can be really helpful when you really.
Absolutely. It's hard. I mean, let's just be honest. To be a parent is hard. Be a parent of a child with a rare disorder is, even harder. And luckily I feel fortunate to be part of the PWS community, but there are so many resources available. I say that, I mean, obviously in comparison to something that's more common, but I think I said it before. I think it was on the recording. It might be tiny, but it's mighty. Like you said, contacting PWSA, if your state chapter, California obviously has a strong chapter, or other families that just have maybe been in that district or kind of know who to contact or who might be that ally, within the district. Because a lot of times the people that are within the education of students with disabilities, I find a lot of them have children also with disabilities. So a lot of them get it and understand where you're coming from, but it's hard as a parent who may not typically didn't go to school to be an educator, and all of a sudden you have all these acronyms or alphabet soup thrown at you, and then you're trying to communicate something, but you didn't say it the right way, and then so they didn't get what you were asking. That can be hard. So sometimes just having those people that you can be like, okay, this is what I'm wanting, am I saying it the right way, to make sure that they're understanding, because you guys might be on the same field and just have no idea, because it can be just different terminology, or what is being asked for. But yeah, no, obviously reaching out to any of the PWSA groups is a great first and ongoing place to go.
All right. So we are down to our last question, and we get to talk about something exciting coming up. So, when is the first 6-week training that you're doing, and how do we sign up? Also, your presentation was amazing and so helpful.
Oh, thank you. So yes, I'm so excited for this. So it's been a little bit of time in the making, just with everything going on. So I've mentioned it in the presentations. So it is a 6-week program. It is going to be live with me. We recently finished a pilot series, so we got some good feedback and making sure that parents have access to some printed materials while we're going through it, because it's a lot of information. I mean, not only did I try to get it all into an hour or 2 hours, this is 6 weeks and I still could go on for another 6 weeks. So, but it's going to be intensive. I want parents to understand there is like homework. I'm going to be asking you to get your child's IEP. If your child has behavior plan, we want to look at it. We want to dissect it, go through it, find areas that, maybe need to be, built up a little bit more, find areas that the school's doing really well, and we can, make note of that. So it's not just listening to me talk, it's going to be interactive. We're going to be talking about plans. So the group will remain small, but it's not a one-time deal. So we're looking at right now maybe offering it quarterly, so that if families need it during the day, they might sign up for a different one if they need it in the evening. Obviously, we're also dealing with multiple time zones. So, we understand all of that can play a role in it, but again, keeping it small, I would say keep an eye out. If you are not signed up for PWSA's newsletter, The Pulse, sign up for it. That is likely where you will get your quickest, fastest answer to all of this. But we are trying to make sure that we have something available for all families to be able to participate. But again, if you don't get in the first 6-week one, I said this then, if we have to do more, we'll do more. A lot depends on what the need is right now and where that's at. But I'm super excited. We are expecting to do one in fall. So that I can say, possibly two in spring, just to kind of get some of that in before the end of the school year. But we will see what feedback we get and what needs are out there. So again, keep an eye out when signing up. I think we're going to have to try to figure out the timing and things, so some families can, if they're willing to wait and do it at a different time than being offered. But I really do want to try to make sure we can get anyone that wants to be involved. And then if there's anything that, like I said, from the presentation, I've started creating stuff. I was going to be posting that, but feel like after being traveling for 3 weeks, I'm kind of getting back into it. I know I was telling Annie that earlier. I'm like getting back into it. It's finally a Monday and I'm at work. So I feel like I can actually get things done. So I'll be posting about that and ways to get copies of all of the one pagers that I've been working on post conference. But there already is a lot of stuff that I have on the website that you can request copies of. Again, I don't work to do all of these things to just be pretty and not have access to. So they are for families, for schools, for therapists, for family members. And again, I'd love to come back on. I feel like there's always questions that are being asked, and sometimes it's easier just to do it this way than try to schedule a full time. Or if you just have a quick question, then it's easier than having to go through everything of trying to get through and do like a full meeting or something.
Well, I love that. Yeah. So you can become a regular on the podcast.
I
So
would love that. I love you
yeah,
guys.
me too. I think it'd be fun. So will you tell people the website and your social to follow you directly?
Absolutely. It's empoweredsolutions.org. So it does have the ED and it's solutions. If you Google or whatever my name and I think Empowered Solutions, it pops up pretty quickly. I think and I say think because I know the different handles. So Instagram, I think it has an underscore empowered underscore solutions, but that is also a really great place to go. I really do try to take anything new or what's happening in the times and how it is affecting whether it's just students with disabilities, students in general. But obviously, the majority of my stuff is specific to the PWS community. Whatever is coming out, new research, new information, strategies, supports. As we start looking at school, I saw people were already posting about, again, this is where they call them like one pagers. I call them like the all about me pages. I have some of those that can be downloaded on the website, but just kind of getting that idea of how to present that information to a teacher quickly without handing over sometimes a 150-page IEP can be a lot easier and great to have also for subfolders. So, things to think about. If a substitute's coming in, what is it that they need to know right then to keep your child safe and strategies that work?
Well, Destiny, we are so very grateful for you in the PWS community and for coming on the podcast and for all that you do. And I'm excited to talk to you again.
Thank you. I am too. I appreciate you having me. We'll do it again soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of PWS United. If you want to learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and how PWSA USA is making strides in advocacy, family support, and research, visit www.pwsausa.org. And while you're there, we encourage you to sign up for our Pulse email newsletter to stay informed about the latest news, resources, and events. Don't forget to subscribe to the PWS United podcast so you never miss an episode. Our team is always available to support families and their loved ones living with PWS 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can call us at 941-312-0400 or email info@pwsausa.org. Catch a new episode next Tuesday, and until then, have a great week.